became an overcorrection. People in the former colonies who praised or emulated aspects of the colonial era were suddenly pariahs. And in the West itself, the pendulum also swung. Where once many people had thought that the West could do nothing wrong, the West entered an era where it became dangerous to concede that the West had ever done anything right. To the surprise of no one, this was whipped along and otherwise encouraged by intellectuals, specifically by those who, though unwilling to lose a drop of blood themselves, seemed keen on considerable bloodletting among other people. One such figure was Jean-Paul Sartre, who in early 1963 wrote the preface to a posthumous work by the Martinique-born anti-colonialist Frantz Fanon. From his first page, Sartre mocked the Western powers for their efforts to create a native elite in the countries they had once ruled. Sartre claimed that the West had imbued these people with the principles of Western culture, including grand, glutinous words that stuck to the teeth, leading natives to be sent home whitewashed. Such people had become walking lies, wrote Sartre. For Sartre, Fanon, by contrast, offered another way. Revolutionary socialism, all together, everywhere. And so Sartre correctly stated that Fanon puts his readers on guard against Western culture. And all this was admirable in Sartre's eyes. For Sartre was a man who claimed to believe that the only true culture is that of the revolution. Sartre talks about people who are rather too westernized and absorbed the witchery of Western culture. And he seems almost panting at the prospect of conflict to come. In the past we made history, he writes, and now it is being made of us. The ratio of forces has been inverted. Decolonization has begun. All that our hired soldiers can do is to delay its completion. The man who Sartre raised the curtain for was equally vengeful. Fanon, who was a huge figure in his day and remains much quoted by anti-colonialist authors, said that when the native hears about Western culture, he pulls out his knife and laughs in mockery when Western values are mentioned. He wrote that in the period of decolonization, the colonized masses mock at these very values, insult them, and vomit them up. Reading Fanon now, one is struck by how much the claims that he made in the 1960s have been built upon in the decades since. For instance, Fanon wrote that the wealth of the imperial countries is our wealth too. Europe is literally the creation of the Third World. According to Fanon, the docks of Bordeaux and Liverpool owe their renown only to their traffic in slaves, and so when we hear the head of a European state declare with his hand on his heart that he must come to the aid of the poor underdeveloped peoples, we do not tremble with gratitude. Quite the contrary, we say to ourselves, it's just a reparation which will be paid to us. For the people of underdeveloped countries, all such payments are their due. The capitalist powers must pay. Likewise, in arguments that would soon become familiar, Fanon condemned the entire Western bourgeoisie as fundamentally racist. Yet he also feared the potency of the ideas that the West exports. Because of the import of Western films, literature, and more, he was worried that the young Africans are at the mercy of the various assaults made upon them by the very nature of Western culture. Fanon didn't know how to deal with this, other than to tell people not to imitate Europe, but to create the whole man who Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. In his rousing conclusion, he claims, 2 centuries ago, a former European colony decided to catch up with Europe. It succeeded so well that the United States of America became a monster in which the taints, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe have grown to appalling dimensions. There are several interesting things about this, not least that Fanon, like many other post-colonial writers who became famous in the West, is not really interested in restoring the cultures of the non-Western countries he claims to care about. He is not interested in returning African nations to an era of tribal customs or any other pre-colonial indigenous tradition. What he is interested in is analyzing these cultures through a Marxist lens, and then saving them by applying a Marxist ideology to them. Naturally, there is something perverse about this. For Marx was a Western thinker with next to no knowledge, let alone experience, of non-Western cultures or societies. Just one of the ironies of the post-colonialist thinkers is that so many take the same path as Fanon. Intent on shrugging off the legacy of Western colonialism, they find an answer for every non-Western society in Western Marxism. Other arguments in Fanon have also become familiar through the West in the decades following. There is, for instance, the argument that the West is especially rapacious, and that, in this regard, it is wholly unlike all other cultures. There is the argument that the West is wholly without virtue, even while it is strangely, indeed dangerously, alluring. And then there is the insistence that revenge is called for, and that the West needs to pay for what it has done. Finally, there is the curious fact that the rage against the imperial powers of the 19th century does not stop at the 19th century imperial powers, but extends to a country that never had an empire, America. An interesting truth can be discerned here. There may be many reasons to criticize the European powers for their empires, but if this is seen as a founding sin, and Western countries that did not have empires are lumped in with those that did, then it would seem that it is not in fact empire that is the problem in the eyes of such critics, but the West itself. The strength and style of Fanon's writing has kept it being read, though its appeal seems mostly to lie in its lust for violence, specifically vengeance, against the West. But there is another thinker after Fanon whose central idea reached even wider and whose interest in the Middle East ended up with him writing a crucially hostile reframing of the West. That writer is Edward Said, a Christian Palestinian born in 1935, who had an unprecedented impact on the way in which significant portions of the West thought about themselves. Like other post-colonial writers, Said's central claim is singularly anti-Western. He is uninterested in crimes committed by non-Western powers, and that disinterest helps lead him to believe that every aspect of the West, even or especially its intellectual and cultural curiosity, is to be not just condemned, but derided. His central work explaining this trend, Orientalism, published in 1978, has become one of the most widely cited books across disciplines in academia. Said's central critique is an attempt to prove that when Westerners encountered other societies, they did so through the lens of the societies they came from. Despite the intelligence and style that Said could bring to his writing and his public debates, this central point is wholly unremarkable. After all, through what other lens might Western travellers and scholars have been expected to look at the Orient? Could they have been expected to look at the Middle East through Chinese eyes? Or Middle Eastern eyes? And why should Western explorers, linguists, and others be held to such a strange standard? It would be curious indeed to expect Arabs to have looked at Europe through European eyes, or for the Chinese to look at the Middle East through Aboriginal eyes. Everybody approaches a different culture through references they have picked up in the culture they are from. There is nothing sinister about this. It is inevitable. Yet, for Said, so long as the people doing the looking are Western, and the cultures being looked at are not, it is very sinister indeed. Everything about the West, even the learning of its scholars, is held against it. For instance, Said wishes to blame Westerners for their allegedly narrow worldview. He ignores the fact that the Orientalists who he spurns were remarkable men and women, people who learned the languages and dialects of faraway societies, and who studied these cultures almost always because they were fascinated by and admired them. Indeed, a significant strain in Orientalism always came from Westerners who admired non-Western culture more than the culture they were from, often as an escape from their own culture. In 19th century Germany, there existed a significant strain of thought that looked to the Orient as a place to give balm to the soul. Yet Said dismisses all of this, and instead levels sinister accusations against the West for all its interactions with the East. He constantly laments the Western tendency to essentialize the East, that is, to not draw precise enough delineations between one group and another, a tendency to lump a disparate group of people under one umbrella. Again, there is nothing so terrible about this. All descriptions must, by necessity, include some generalization. Not every sentence can be the length of a dissertation. Concepts that sum up large swaths of peoples, including the West, are useful, even if they cannot sum up everything contained therein. But an interesting aspect of Said's judgment in this is that while he loathes essentializing in others, he indulges in it frequently himself. For instance, at one point in his most famous work, he says, "It is therefore correct that every European in what he could say about the Orient was consequently a racist, an imperialist, and almost totally ethnocentric." Every European? Every single one? Where is the evidence to support that fact? If you replaced the word European in that sentence with African, Arab, or even Palestinian Christian, what might you be called? Elsewhere, Said refers in passing perfectly blithely to an average 19th century European. What is that, you wonder? It essentializes an awfully large array of people. But there was always in Said a tendency to single out Western man and woman for a unique form of attack. This included extraordinarily hostile and ungenerous attacks on two of the great female writers of the 19th century, George Eliot and Jane Austen. Said's attack on Jane Austen in one of his later books is a classic of anti-Westernism. For there, Said tries to smear Austen as a supporter of the slave trade. He does so through a solitary reference to slavery that appears in Mansfield Park during a conversation between Edmund and Fanny. In an exchange that takes up no more than a few lines of text, Austen's heroine and her husband-to-be discuss the fact that there had been such a dead silence the night before, when Fanny's uncle, who had just returned from a plantation in Antigua, had been asked about the recently abolished slave trade. Said believes that this single reference means that Austen is praising the slave trade. He makes this argument through two means. The first is that he attacks Austen by referring to later novels by other authors, including Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, saying that if we read Austen in their light, that single reference acquires a slightly greater density than that of the discreet, reticent appearances it makes in the pages of Mansfield Park. Doubtless that is so. By the same light, we might try to apply Holocaust literature to the pages of Pride and Prejudice, and marvel that this too would take on a similar density. But it would still be a strange thing to do. Stranger still is that Said should choose to use one statement by a character in a novel, a statement that incidentally suggests that the character in question is an abolitionist, to smear not just that character, but her creator, Jane Austen, as embroiled in the great sin of slavery. But through intellectual sleights of hand like this, Said provided a playbook for others who wished to criticize the West. Among his most important techniques was to interpret everything in the West, including the most delicate and perfect works of art, through a lens that was not just interrogative and hostile, but amazingly ungenerous. In doing so, he held the West to standards expected of no other society, and then castigated the West for failing to live up to these standards. He also helped to create an interpretation of the world in which the non-Western peoples were people to whom things were done, while the Western people were people who did things, and terrible things at that. Coming out of the post-colonial period, Said gave added impetus to a feeling that was already underway, a feeling that the West itself was overdue for some justice, or rather, revenge. Empire. In April 2015, there were a set of protests at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. The university had a statue on its campus of the famed 19th century imperialist Cecil Rhodes. The statue was there because Rhodes had donated the land for the university to be built on. But for some years, students and others at the university had argued that the statue was a symbol of colonial aggression and white supremacy, and so should come down. Eventually, a Rhodes Must Fall movement was formed by students and others. The University Council finally voted for the statue's removal, and down it came. As ever, in the present era, what happens in one continent swiftly spreads to another. In this case, it transferred swiftly to England and the University of Oxford. One of the things that Cecil Rhodes provided for in his will was the endowment of a scholarship scheme so that students from the United States, Germany, and the then British Empire would be able to study at Oxford. he insisted on a number of stipulations for the scholarships. One of these was that no student shall be qualified or disqualified for election on account of race or religious opinions. The first black student won a Rhodes Scholarship 5 years after Rhodes's death. Since then, students from around the world, not least from South Africa, have benefited from the scheme. Nevertheless, in recent decades, there had been growing unease about the legacy of such an unabashed imperialist. In 2003, Nelson Mandela agreed to have his name appended to the scholarship scheme. That year, the Rhodes Scholarships officially became known as the Mandela Rhodes Scholarships. Asked about why he would agree to have his name linked with the great imperialist, Mandela said that South Africa's new constitution includes an injunction for us to come together across the historical divides, to build our country together with a future equally shared by all. But more than a decade after this gesture of reconciliation was agreed to, it seemed to have done nothing to placate a new generation of students. Not least the South African students in Oxford publicly involved in the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, who appeared keen to use the international attention the issue brought to make names for themselves back home. Oriel College, Oxford, was founded in 1326, and Cecil Rhodes studied there in the 1870s. Before his death in 1902, he arranged a considerable financial bequest to the college. In addition to the scholarship scheme, his will allowed for a new building to be built for the college. It was completed in 1911 and was adorned with several statues, including one of Rhodes himself. There, high above street level, his statue stood unmolested for over a century. However, after the campaign success of Rhodes Must Fall in Cape Town, the same campaign was effectively transplanted to Oxford. The main impetus for it came at first from a number of South African students, one of whom, Thokozo Kwabe, was actually on a Rhodes Scholarship at the time. Many well-meaning students from Britain and around the world joined the South African student leader, who claimed that the statue was an example of structural violence, and that this violence was not limited to a statue on a building. According to Kwabe, the structural violence is like the curriculum, the lack of black professors. Those things are not just exceptions. They go to the very heart of how Oxford is configured, and how Oxford as a space is, to be quite frank, racist. And this is what we are saying, that blatant violence and assault and racism is unacceptable at a university that purports to be inclusive. Soon the claims of the anti-Rhodes campaigners grew. The Rhodes Must Fall petition in Oxford claimed that by failing to remove the statue of Rhodes, Oriel College and Oxford University as a whole continue to tacitly identify with Rhodes's values and to maintain a toxic culture of domination and oppression. The petition attracted a considerable number of signatures from across the university. Subsequent demonstrations attracted large numbers of students. To a great extent, these students, short on time, were mobilized by things that the anti-Rhodes campaign claimed that Rhodes himself had said. These quotes were immensely helpful for growing the campaign against Rhodes, for they were short, pithy, and abhorrent. The petition to the authorities at Oxford University cited several quotes from Cecil Rhodes, describing him as an apartheid colonialist. They claimed that his statements included this one: "I prefer land to N-word. The natives are like children. They are just emerging from barbarism. One should kill as many N-words as possible. These quotations were then picked up and used by other media when reporting on the petition and protests. And they are terrible quotes indeed, for they showed Rhodes to be not only a racist, but someone advocating genocide against black Africans. At such moments, with such damning material put in front of everyone, it is not easy to even query such material. But a small number of people at Oxford did, including students. They began to look at the sources of the quotes that the anti-Rhodes campaign was using, and look into their claims about Rhodes's life. What they found revealed a deep dishonesty. The anti-Rhodes petition itself offered no sources for its quotations, but the quote did turn up, ellipses and all, in a book review in the Times Literary Supplement in 2006. The author of that piece, Adekeye Adebayo, happened to be a former Rhodes Scholar himself, and was quoting from a book under review by Paul Maylam. That book makes it clear that the three phrases were all said at different times, but all three parts of the quote turned out to be unstable in their sourcing. These include a work from 1957 that is not a work of scholarship, and in which the author admits in the introduction that he has not given references in footnotes so as not to interrupt the continuity of the story. The first statement is said by Maylam to have been made by Rhodes to Olive Schreiner at a dinner, but the only source is Schreiner herself, who used the phrase in a novel of hers in 1897 and claimed that it came from Rhodes's mouth during a speech to the Cape Parliament. It has been shown that Schreiner herself had a faulty memory on the matter and was almost certainly referring to a speech Rhodes gave to the Cape House in 1892 on taxation and governance, in which he said, "You want to annex land rather than natives. Hitherto we have been annexing natives instead of land." The second part of the alleged quotation comes from a speech by Rhodes to the Cape Town Parliament in 1894. The full paragraph reads, "Now I say the natives are children. They are just emerging from barbarism. They have human minds, and I would like them to devote themselves wholly to the local matters that surround them and appeal to them. I would let them tax themselves and give them the funds to spend on these matters, the building of roads and bridges, the making of plantations and other such works. I propose that the House shall allow these people to tax themselves, and that the proceeds of their taxation shall be spent by them on the development of themselves and of their districts." But the third part of the quotation, "One should kill as many N-words as possible," is surely the most reprehensible quote of all. Again, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign made no attempt to reference where it came from. Again, the source would appear to be Adebayo's review of Maylam, and yet this is not what Rhodes is quoted as saying in that work. There, Rhodes is alleged to have said, "You should kill as many as you can." There is no use of the N-word. That word has been inserted by the activists of Rhodes Must Fall. As for the rest of the quote, Maylam cites a 1913 biography of Rhodes as his source, and if we look at this source, then the context of the quote becomes clear. The 1913 biography quotes an unidentified officer who heard Rhodes say, after an especially bloody battle with some rebels, "Well, you should not spare them. You should kill all you can, as it serves a lesson to them when they talk things over at their fires at night." In other words, The statement attributed to him by Rhodes Must Fall activists, and assumed to be true by the vast majority of people who will have read it, was a wholesale misrepresentation. Indeed, it was more than a misrepresentation. It was a lie. The quotation was not a single quote from Rhodes, but a conglomeration of 3 alleged quotes, the first of which was from a novel, the second of which was from a speech advocating for increased African self-determination, and the third of which is an outright fabrication. Why do these details matter? Rhodes was certainly a colonialist. He was certainly a believer in the British Empire. Would a critique of this not be enough? Why would anybody need to lie and exaggerate the offence? Certainly, there are people who claim that there is an overdue reckoning or rebalancing needed for historical figures such as Rhodes. But why would they decide to base such a reckoning not on the rights or wrongs of empire or a weighing up of its human costs and benefits, but rather on an outright lie? Or rather, on a set of lies? Why would a reckoning with the legacy of empire not be enough? Why is it necessary to slip in racist epithets in order to make the past worse than it was, and to make important figures in it all come out looking like racist monsters? Among those who started to carry out his own research was Nigel Biggar, the Regius Professor of Ethics, who is also a canon at Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford. As well as being deeply unassuming and polite, he is also a famously rigorous scholar. When the Rhodes Must Fall campaign began, he started by doing what any diligent scholar might do, and read the essay on Rhodes in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. From there, he developed a growing interest, not just in Rhodes, but in the whole way in which empire was being approached. Without issuing any political pronouncements in any way, he suggested that the university could best respond to current turmoils by doing what universities are meant to be best at: scholarship. He proposed that the university should set up a project composed of historians and others dedicated to looking into the ethics of empire. Biggar suggested that this was a serious and understudied area. That much was provable. One reason why the Rhodes Must Fall campaign went so far so fast was precisely because the study of empire had become unfashionable, and so, whatever people's views on it, institutional and individual knowledge of what had happened and who had said what had been slipping away for more than a generation. If the university and the wider country was interested in working out its attitudes toward the past, then it should study the past. The rise of post-colonial studies had been a necessary correction within academia, but that period itself now needed interrogating. For, to assess the legacy of empire, it is necessary to assess the period in the round. Just as a previous period had been unable to admit to any flaws in empire, so the post-colonial period had been unable to recognize anything positive that had happened, leading to claims that were ahistorical and just plain wrong. But a second problem Biggar identified was that this solely negative view of empire that led to a feeling of guilt among former colonial powers had in turn led to a reluctance to deal with any of the world's present-day problems. Former colonial powers that had found themselves constantly compared with the worst regimes of the 20th century might easily find themselves denuded of the will or confidence to act even against serious rights abuses going on around the world today. The result, in other words, could be Western inertia, something over which other powers might happily seek advantage. A similar point had recently been made by another academic, Bruce Gilley, who, rather remarkably, was employed at Portland State University. In 2017, Gilly had published a paper in Third World Quarterly titled The Case for Colonialism that argued that recent attempts to turn the term colonialism into a wholly negative concept were a mistake. As he wrote, "The notion that colonialism is always and everywhere a bad thing needs to be rethought in light of the grave human toll of a century of anti-colonial regimes and policies." He argued that there was a need to accurately re-evaluate the past in order to improve the future. In both cases, Biggar and Gilly, this call for level-headedness and historical fairness did not go down well with their respective critics. In the case of Gilly, there was such a backlash to his article that 15 members of the 34-member editorial board of the journal that published it resigned in protest. Despite having gone through all the necessary peer review processes before publication, petitions, and even threats of violence against the journal's editor led to the article being withdrawn and the publication apologizing for ever having published it. Gilly himself was also attacked, accused of white supremacy by fellow academics, and subjected to death threats. Biggar did not get off much more lightly. After he announced his intention to launch a program looking into the ethics of empire, a collection of more than 50 of his fellow academics at Oxford wrote a joint letter to the Times condemning his initiative. They said that it was not possible to create a balance book of positive entries to counterbalance, for example, the Amritsar massacre. They accused Biggar of ignorance, of misstating the current state of the debate, and indeed of talking nonsense. Other academics associated with the project were pressured to resign, and did so. According to the anti-Biggar scholars, no historian, or as far as we know, any cultural critic or post-colonial theorist, argues simply that imperialism was wicked, which simply suggested that the signatories had not read very far. This letter was then joined by a further letter from more than 170 scholars around the world who wrote condemning Oxford for even considering giving a birth to Biggar's proposed programme. These critics accused Biggar of being a long-time apologist for colonialism and of aiming to provide a rehabilitation of the British Empire. A student group aiming to challenge racism and colonialism claimed that Biggar's project was yet more evidence of Oxford racism. An academic at Cambridge referred to him as a gnarled old racist, and on the announcement of the course declared on social media with great academic rigour, "OMG, this is serious shit! We need to shut this down!" Elsewhere, Biggar's scholarship was dismissed as supremacist shite. He was called a racist and a bigot, and told that whatever came out of his mouth was vomit. The treatment of Biggar, like the treatment of Gilly, suggested something more than normal academic disagreement. The backlash suggested that these scholars had crossed over some unspoken threshold. And of course, they had. Just as in the early 20th century, the default consensus at a university such as Oxford would have been that the empire was a force for good, so by the early 21st century, it had become the default position at such places that the empire was solely a force for bad. The dogma had simply shifted. So now, it was not even possible to try to weigh up the moral complexities of empire without being accused of being an apologist for or supporter of colonialism. Inadvertently, these critics showed the fragility of their arguments. Because other people, not least in the countries that had been colonized, were capable of thinking with far greater nuance. For instance, the Nigerian novelist and hero of anti-colonialism, Chinua Achebe, said in 2012, "The legacy of colonialism is not a simple one, but one of great complexity, with contradictions, good things as well as bad." And in his final book, There Was a Country, 2012, Achebe wrote, "Here is a piece of heresy. The British governed their colony of Nigeria with considerable care. There was a very highly competent cadre of government officials imbued with a high level of knowledge of how to run a country. British colonies were, more or less, expertly run. One was not consumed by fear of abduction or armed robbery. One had a great deal of confidence and faith in British institutions. Now all that is changed." Achebe is not alone in his assessment. Scholars and writers such as Nirad C. Chowdhury and Dr. Zaria Masani have argued eloquently in the case of India that what the empire left behind was not just the railroads and the Indian civil service, but the scholarship of men such as Sir William Jones and James Princip, who unlocked the classical language of India and handed that civilization back to itself. Many others have made a similar case. Bishop Michael Nazir Ali, born in Pakistan in 1949, has pointed out that in India and Pakistan there is a common recognition of this complex legacy. As he has said, while there is no doubt that white nabobs made themselves wealthy at the expense of the local population, there were also those such as Sir Charles Napier, who abolished slavery in the province of Sindh while he was governor in the 1840s, and who famously outlawed the practice of suttee, the burning of a widow alive on her husband's funeral pyre. The Punjabis called Sir John Lawrence the saviour of the Punjab, and General John Jacob created the irrigation system around the city of Jacobabad, which made the whole area fertile. The oddity of those who argue against weighing up the various merits and demerits of empire is twofold. First, they say that it cannot be done. There is no way to form the moral calculus necessary to work such things out. Then, they insist that in any case, because of a specific terrible thing that happened, any positives must be discounted. In the case of the academics at Oxford who objected to the study of empire, the whole idea of weighing up the merits of empire was obscene because of the Amritsar massacre of 1919. But the example they give highlights the absurdity of their position. After all, there is a reason why the Amritsar massacre is so well known that it is still remembered over a century later. The brutal shooting at a crowd that led to the deaths of 379 people would not have been remembered if it had been carried out in the 20th century by Japanese or Chinese troops. It would not have been remembered if it had been carried out by Russian troops, and it would hardly have registered if it had been carried out in the 20th century by German troops. It is remembered because the massacre was carried out by British troops. It was not just an exception, but one which caused deep anger and shame in Britain even as it happened. The general responsible for ordering the soldiers to fire on the unarmed protesters, General Dyer, was removed from his command, forced into retirement, and stripped of his pension. Among the many people in Britain who expressed horror at his actions was Winston Churchill, who told the House of Commons in a debate in 1920 that the massacre at Amritsar appears to me to be without precedent or parallel in the modern history of the British Empire. It is an event of an entirely different order from any of those tragical occurrences which take place when troops are brought into collision with the civil population. It is an extraordinary event, a monstrous event, an event which stands in singular and sinister isolation. It may not be possible to answer, but is it not an interesting question to ask why this one monstrous event, or any number of others, could not be weighed up against any good the British Empire did? Does it get outweighed by the British Empire's decision not only to abolish slavery in its colonies, but to police the seas in order to outlaw it across the world? If not, then why not? And if the sins of the West are ineradicable, then are the sins of all other peoples ineradicable too? Or is it only Western crimes that are judged in such a light? Nobody appears to know the answer to these questions. More sinister is the fact that nobody is even meant to ask them. As it happens, there were several coders to the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. Oriel College promised to scrap the Rhodes statue and then promised to save it. The college then agreed to have it withdrawn and also agreed not to do anything about it. This is where the situation currently stands. Since coming to fame for his Rhodes Must Fall activism, Kozo Kwabe returned to South Africa, where he briefly made headlines in May 2016 when he boasted in a Facebook post about something so black and wonderful that had happened that he couldn't stop smiling. The wonderful thing was that in a restaurant with a friend, he had bullied a white waitress, telling her he would give her a tip when you return the land. When the waitress burst into tears, he laughed and dismissed her tears as typical white tears. Later, back at the University of Cape Town, Rhodes having gone, Kwabe was involved with the new Fees Must Fall campaign and was reported to have whipped a white student with a stick while racially abusing him. Kwabe took to Facebook to object. He admitted that he had hit the student's phone out of his hand with a protest stick he always carries around with him for cultural purposes, but he said that he had not whipped the student. However, Kwabe added, "I wish I'd actually not been a good law-abiding citizen and whipped the white apartheid settler colonial entitlement out of the bastard." The white student told the media that he did not want to be identified. "It's a month to exams. I just need to pass," he pleaded. Meanwhile, in Cape Town, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign went from strength to strength, even after Rhodes had fallen. The following year, Rhodes Must Fall activists burned artwork, set a bus and other vehicles on fire, and petrol-bombed the offices of the university's vice-chancellor. Slavery. In recent years, the critics of the West have marked themselves out through a set of extraordinary claims. Their technique now has a pattern. It is to zoom in on Western behavior, remove it from the context of the time, set aside any non-Western parallels, and then exaggerate what the West actually did. The case of slavery is a pertinent one. For slavery has been a constant in almost every society since the dawn of recorded history. In antiquity, slaves came from Ethiopia and then farther afield. When the Muslim empires arose, they expanded the trade. As the Muslim empire spread across West Africa during the Middle Ages, it made possible the trading of black slaves across the Sahara. Some ended up in Muslim Spain and Portugal. But when Ferdinand of Aragon and Charles V agreed to a couple of hundred and then 4,000 slaves to be shipped to the New World, they can have had no idea of the change that they were bringing about. From the 1400s to the 1800s, somewhere between 10 and 12 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the New World. The slaves that were brought out of Africa not only suffered the indignity of being ripped away from their homeland and taken abroad without their permission, they suffered the additional indignity of having been sold by their neighbours and families. There were times when the Portuguese, among others, seized slaves after a military campaign in Africa, but the overwhelming majority of slaves taken out of Africa during these centuries were a result of man-stealing and selling, where neighbours, enemies, and sometimes families of Africans would sell other Africans on. Some of the few slave memoirs, such as that of Olaudah Equiano, attest to this fact. Yet this fact, among others, is a testament to the fact that the history of slavery is far more universally morally compromising than the current discussion is remotely willing to concede. For while historical attention is now almost exclusively interested in one direction of slavery, throughout the last millennium, as throughout history, the horror went in every direction. And while huge attention has been paid in recent years to the trade in slaves that went west, very little has been expended on the trade that went east. So little, indeed, that estimates on the numbers of African slaves who were put into the Arab slave trade are even wider as well as higher in their range than the transatlantic trade. The best available figures, proposed by scholars such as Professor Ralph Austin of the University of Chicago, is that somewhere between 11 and 17 million Africans were traded east in the Arab-run slave trade. One reason why the numbers are so difficult to discern is that unlike the transatlantic trade, the slaves the Arabs traded were systematically castrated after being brought from Africa, which of course ensured that there was neither a second generation of slaves nor any other descendants. Why is this trade so little focused upon? The scholar Tidiane Diaye is one of those who has questioned this. In Le Génocide voilé, The Veiled Genocide, 2008. He proposes that Arabs have an obvious desire to downplay their 13 centuries of uninterrupted trading in human beings from sub-Saharan Africa. He also suggests that they ignore it because the Arab nations would much rather maintain pressure on the West by continuing to encourage a focus on the transatlantic trade. It is interesting that almost all the scholarship on this area is now being carried out by French or French-speaking historians and anthropologists. The English-speaking countries appear uninterested in the matter. Other areas get almost as little attention. For instance, in the modern interest in slavery, very little attention is paid to the fact that between the 16th and 19th centuries, Barbary pirates, that is, Muslim pirates mainly from North Africa, carried out constant raids not just on European ships, but against coastal towns and cities across Europe. During these years, the Barbary pirates raided and stole inhabitants of the countries on the northern side of the Mediterranean, including Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France. But they also stole people from as far away as Britain and the Netherlands. The people captured, all white Europeans, would then be either used for ransom or sold into slavery. Over the years during which the Barbary pirates operated, it is believed that they stole as many as 1.25 million Europeans from their homes. Of course, there is no movement of reparations for those people or their descendants, and no European has seriously suggested trying to find out where any bill for compensation should be sent. To the extent that it is known about today, it is recognized to be just one of the many bloody and brutal things that went on in the centuries before our own. Worse for the people who suffered it than other forms of slavery, but no morally better or worse in itself. If it is agreed that everybody did bad things in the past, then it is possible to move on and even to move past it. Who wants to litigate or relitigate a past in which nobody's ancestors were saints? Some people